RPGs have been handling XP the same way for almost 50 years. Ever since Dungeons & Dragons released back in the 70s, players have been getting XP from killing monsters and completing quests, and using that XP to level up. Nobody really seems to question it, but I think we're in need of a serious revamp. Let me give you an example. I recently restarted Divinity Original Sin 2, and when I encountered the esteemed Royal Fire Slug, I initially tried to charm my way past. I began explaining that I was simply a humble messenger, sent by her husband to make amends for his mistakes. But as I was about to convince her not to attack me, I paused, sighed, and thought to myself, I just want the XP. And so, I killed the Royal Fire Slug and her Fire Slug servants to gain 3000 XP and get a little bit closer to level 4. Not exactly a great story. Sort of like when Luke Skywalker killed all the Ewoks so he'd have enough combat experience to fight Darth Vader. And look, I'm not saying I had to do that. I could have played the part and tried my best to talk it out. But I know how these games work. You need to gain experience to take on bigger challenges, and this piñata was too tempting to ignore. This got me thinking about how games handle XP. Most games reward a violent playstyle, handing out tons of experience for combat while giving little for anything else. This is often true even in games where talking or sneaking is an option. You're mechanically incentivized to fight, even if you want to roleplay a less violent approach. Killing enemies is usually one of the core ways to gain XP, and this creates a number of different problems. In Divinity, there are a limited number of enemies in the entire game, so you're incentivized to find and destroy every last one, regardless of the other options you have. In games where enemies do respawn, level grinding exists. Now, some games do like to ensure that there's always more XP available for players who really need it, like Elden Ring. But I think for a lot of games, the existence of level grinding is more of an unintended consequence than something they're looking to promote. Third, the actions your character takes often have little to do with the skill you're improving. Not good enough at lockpicking to break into a secret vault? Go fight a bunch of mutants and use your next level on lockpicking. When experience is generic, the best way to increase a skill is to farm XP, and that usually means fighting. These three problems have one thing in common. If you reward fighting above all else, players will find ways to justify killing monsters they normally wouldn't. So how did we get here? Well, these systems can be traced all the way back to Dungeons & Dragons. In a tabletop game, set experience drops provide a simple way to handle progression. Being a dungeon master is hard enough, and having to decide how much experience each encounter should give would be an extra burden. The DM might choose to award XP for other activities or quests, but the drip feed from combat provides a solid baseline. When role-playing games started to go digital, developers imitated D&D as closely as possible. Many of the best old-school RPGs directly use the D&D rule set. Games like Pool of Radiance, Neverwinter Nights, and Baldur's Gate wore their Dungeons & Dragons affiliation as a badge of honor, and this meant using the same systems as tabletop players. The problem is that these systems were designed for tabletop games, and unsurprisingly work better for them. Let's look back at my experience with the Royal Fire Slug, to see how it would be different if I was instead playing a tabletop game. Well, after using my quick wit and intelligence to get past the fire slugs, the Dungeon Master could choose to award my party with XP for talking our way out. Divinity is hesitant to do this, because then players could just talk past the slugs and kill them anyway, effectively double dipping on experience. If you tried that in a tabletop game, the DM could just come up with some excuse to keep you from abusing the system. But let's say the DM didn't award any XP for talking past the slugs. That's also fine, because each session is handcrafted by the Dungeon Master. If our party doesn't level up as fast, it's totally fine as long as the DM tailors the game to our party's level. And if we need to level up faster, we'll just stumble across some magic genie fairy pizza that gives us 5000 XP. In a video game, there's always the fear of being too weak for the late game, so you want to get as much experience as you can. But in a tabletop game, that's the Dungeon Master's problem. Tabletops also don't usually allow for level grinding. I don't know about you guys, but I've never played a D&D campaign where the party just roamed around fighting dozens of kobolds without any story. Again, the DM sets the difficulty of each session, so there's no need to grind. The next challenge can always be calibrated to where the party's at. Now, Dungeons & Dragons doesn't really do a better job at tying your actions to skill progression. Experience points are generic, and whether you get them from fishing or fighting, level 4 is level 4. Still, I would argue that this is less of an issue here. If you're playing a Dungeons & Dragons campaign, your party is going to fight sooner or later. Video game RPGs have pushed nonviolent skills and playthroughs way further than D&D ever intended, and so these systems weren't built to handle these approaches. So what are the alternatives that digital RPGs can use? Well, luckily for us, there are some games that are taking a different approach, ones that are much more intentionally designed for the medium of video games. The Elder Scrolls games do a fantastic job of tying your skills to the actions you take. In Skyrim, you don't get generic XP that you can use on anything. Instead, each skill has its own XP tracker separate from all the others. Once enough skills have leveled up, your character levels up, giving you a chance to choose a perk for one of your skills. This system directly ties your actions to your progression, and shapes your character based on the way you play. If you hit stuff with a sword, you'll get better at swordsmanship. If you make potions, you'll get better at alchemy, and if you sneak past enemies, you'll get better at stealth. It makes sense to lean into your character's playstyle because that's the only way you're going to improve at those skills. Hunting skeletons isn't going to make you any better at lockpicking. Skyrim actually makes role-playing your character strategically optimal, and that's a pretty impressive feat. Underrail has one of the most unique approaches I've ever seen. If you choose to play the game using the oddity system, you only get experience for completing quests and collecting oddities. These oddities are strewn around the world and can be found by exploring. The harder it is to get, the more experience it'll grant. This puts the burden on exploring the world and getting to these oddities in any way possible, regardless of what approach you take. I think the Underrail wiki puts it perfectly. Quote, "The main purpose of this system is to allow players to level at a similar rate, regardless of what their build and playstyle is. Going through the world stealthily, guns blazing, or in some cases diplomatically, or anything in between should now earn you a similar amount of experience." End quote. There are some oddities that you can only get from killing enemies, but you can only get a limited amount of experience this way. This means that players who take a combat-oriented approach will still get rewarded for fighting, but other playstyles will have other opportunities to get oddities. This limit on combat XP also puts a stop to level grinding. Once you've gotten past a certain number of a specific oddity, it stops giving you any more experience. For example, Junkyard Muties drop acid-burnt bones. You can study 4 bones to gain XP, but after that, you're not going to learn much more. I love that Stygian Software decided to take a risk and try something really different. I want to see more developers create unique experience systems. Underrail proves that there's untapped potential here, and that more creative ideas could address big game design questions. As I was writing this essay, it became clear to me just how much we still rely on systems that were designed for tabletop RPGs, some of which don't translate as well as we might think. Video games are still a young medium compared to film, music, or theater, and experience systems are one of those small things we still need to figure out. Let me know in the comment section if you have another example of a great XP system. And if you're interested in essays about video game design, consider subscribing. It helps out a lot. Thanks for watching.